Welcome to a sunny new podcast where I'll be speaking to people from the arts, business and beyond, and shining a light on their stories of success on the South Coast. This week's guest is Paul Kinkaid. Paul was a senior officer in the British Army, commanding elite teams in 44 countries on 5 continents over a 20-year career. And he now shares his expertise to help good leaders get better. Paul is also an international speaker, an executive coach and the best-selling author of Forensic Leadership, The Traces We Leave Behind. In this episode, we talk about leading during times of change or uncertainty, how forensic science inspired Paul's innovative leadership framework, and how being conscious, deliberate and intentional makes you a better leader. Paul is really entertaining company, so I'm positive this episode will leave green traces on you all. So if you're sitting comfortably, let's do this. Welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, as I said to you off camera, it's just been such a pleasure for me doing this podcast. I had no idea when I started it that I'd get the opportunity to sit down with someone like yourself, a real student of leadership with a 20-year military career, and now having gone on to share all those stories and wisdom in the corporate world. So today we're predominantly going to be talking about your innovative leadership concept, which I absolutely love. I really enjoyed your TED talk, and now we've got the book that was released only last month, so it's perfect timing to have this conversation. So you're now a leadership advisor, executive coach, speaker, not to forget author,
best-selling author.
And I always think, I love talking to new people, and I always really like to get to know the people behind the work.
Sure.
And I think particularly with someone with your background, I think it's even more relevant in terms of how it shaped your philosophy. So to start with, would you mind, for the benefit of the audience, sharing a bit about your career in the Army and your first experiences in leadership?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, the first experiences in leadership predate the Army through sports teams at college and university and school and all that kind of stuff. And I was Army Barmy. From 5 years old, I picked up the sticks, and you've seen it in the TED talk as well. I picked up the sticks and used those as guns, and either lacked the imagination to put them back down again or had a drive to join. I prefer to think it's the latter, but maybe it's the former, I'm not sure. Joined the Army Cadets, then joined the University Officer Training Corps at university, and it was always going to be, for me, assuming I passed all the various selection criteria, that I was going to be an Army officer. And I consider myself very, very fortunate to have been presented that opportunity. So I did the selection process. It was called the Regular Commissions Board. Back when I did it, it's now the Army Officer Selection Board, AOSB. Passed that sufficiently well enough to get a bursary through university, so they paid for the odd drink or two through university, and then went to Sandhurst for a year. That started in 97, where you get taught sort of how to be a soldier first and then how to lead and be an officer second, which predominantly looks at servant leadership, which is you are there as a leader to serve those around you and make sure that things get done in an effective and efficient way. Commissioned in 98 and deployed immediately on operations overseas, and that's where your leadership is truly tested.
Wow.
So I was destined to be the second in command of an engineering workshop. I landed in Bosnia, which was where I deployed to for the first time, the former Yugoslavia, only to be told that I wasn't going to be second in command of the engineering workshop. I was going to be in charge of an infantry platoon out on the ground holding 30 soldiers, all of whom have served for longer than I have.
And how old were you at that point?
23, 24.
Okay, so properly in at the deep end.
Yeah, and most of my peers actually came straight from graduating, as I did, but because I wasn't as sharp as everyone else, I took a little bit longer time to get to university. So I was a little bit older, perhaps a little wiser, I don't know, or just made more mistakes en route to getting there. But yeah, straight in at the deep end, the least experienced person in the platoon of 30, but the one in charge of it.
Well, it's quite a story, and I'm sure we'll come back to some other tales of your experience.
Sure.
But you kind of talked about that selection process, which I always find interesting, because one thing I wanted to ask you about is people talk about this kind of idea of like born or kind of natural leaders.
Yeah.
And I wondered what your thoughts on that were.
Interesting. I think some people are born with a propensity to lead because of the context in which they are born into supports them in their development in order to, perhaps lead should they choose to. And I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But most leaders are made, absolutely made. And the top trait for any leader, according to Kinkaid, is the will to lead. If you don't want to lead, you're not going to lead.
No.
So you'll have people who have got talent, massive talent, and are put into leadership appointments in business or in any walk of life who don't want to lead.
This is that classic story of the technical expert.
Absolutely, exactly
or
that.
someone who's been around for so long that they're promoted, but actually they're much happier doing what it was they were doing previously. So going back to your story then, how were you selected, and what are the kind of characteristics that the army were looking for in its leaders?
Well, it chooses its leaders at a young age, for a start. So they're looking, historically, what have you done in your life to date that shows you might be a bit of a go-getter. But the Army Officer Selection Board, as it is called now, has specific assessments that are designed specifically for it as well.
Okay.
So there's intelligence tests, there's some psychometric assessments, there's interviews, there's essays, there's group discussions, there's leadership and leaderless tasks. So here's a bottomless chasm, you've got these various items to get over it. How do you do it? You can't touch anything that's red, you can touch something that's green. Ironic, given what's in the book. And they're looking for your ability to think logically, communicate soundly, think critically, and be able to plan. And the Army Officer Selection Board, I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed its mission, but it is to select people who, after training, can lead a troop or platoon of soldiers on operations. Okay. So they're looking for that adaptability to be able to be trained, rather than be the finished article before you get there, because they don't want the finished article, because they're going to train you to not think the way they want you to think, but behave in the way they want their officers to behave.
That it's really interesting hearing what a kind of comprehensive, robust sort of assessment process that goes on, because it's completely different to what you see in different walks of life. Very different to what we've talked about probably in the corporate world.
Yeah. Well, it's like an assessment centre, isn't it? Lots of organisations now have assessment centres, and didn't when I was going through what was called the Regular Commissions Board. So you had people who would go to the RCB in order to get a pass with no intention of joining the army. They would go to big business, and say, I've got an RCB pass. Brilliant, in you come. How much do you want? Yeah. Because it was that robust a selection process.
No.
And still is.
We'll definitely come back to that. But the other question I was interested to ask is, can you remember the first great leader that you came across? And give us an idea of what you learned from them.
Do you know, I can, and it was in stark contrast to the person who was supposed to be the leader at the time, if that makes sense. I won't mention that individual, but they covered me in red traces, which perhaps we'll speak about later. It was the Sergeant Major of the company that I joined in Bosnia. He was the Sergeant Major is the senior soldier in that company group, so that's about anywhere between 120 and 180 soldiers. He or she is the senior soldier. So they've done probably 16 to 20 years by the time they get to Sergeant Major. They've seen it, they've done it, and they're very experienced. And he, Will, his name was very calm, which I really appreciated.
Yeah.
Wise, would sit down and let you speak. So he had time, he wasn't an old school Windsor Davies Sergeant Major, you lovely boys, and all that sort of thing. He was, he had time, he was humble, but when he spoke, you listened. There was a wisdom that came from it.
Okay.
So it was that he genuinely cared about the troops around him as well. And that was sort of one of the first examples I had of great leadership coming from a position of care.
That's perfect, and we'll definitely dig more into that, because that's obviously informed a big part of your philosophy.
For sure.
So, as people probably know from the title, one of the key themes of this podcast is success, and I'm always interested in, we'll talk later about what it means to you today, but I always like to kind of explore how that concept of success has evolved for people throughout their life. So I just wonder, if you cast your mind back to your early days, your mid-20s in the military, what do you think success would have meant to you at that point?
Two things, really. I think one was progression. I was big about significance. You get promoted, you get qualifications in the military, and that was a big thing. I wanted to promote, I wanted to get acknowledged, sort of significance, if you like. That whole progress quickly. There were challenges there were courses to be done, there were further selection processes to become an army commando, for example. Not everyone who applies for that, firstly, will get it, and secondly, will get through. There's a high attrition rate. So it was that ability to progress and do things that were put in front of me, and meet those challenges head on and achieve within those challenging environments. That was one way that I measured success. And the other way was very insular. So one was looking for external validation, if you like, which is I find it quite a young person's approach to success. It's quite naive. And the other one, which was sort of just still growing within me at the time, was that ability just to be the best I could be. And therefore radiate that out to enable others to be the best they could be.
And that's a very positive way of measuring success, I think.
I've held on to one of those definitions to this day. And you'll guess which one it is.
Guess which one. I while I've got the opportunity to speak to someone like yourself, I really am keen to explore how people in civilian life can benefit from your experiences. You've led in under real pressure, we're talking life or death kind of scenarios in really hostile environments. So in many ways that kind of puts challenges in the average corporation in perspective. But it must also teach you certain lessons that, I'm hoping we and the audience can benefit from. So one of those things is leading through change and uncertainty, because I'm assuming, in military operations that there must be a significant number of unknowns and uncertainty, and you're continually adapting to changing scenarios. So what do you think your experiences in dealing with that could help other leaders in the face of uncertainty?
It's a great question, and there's uncertainty everywhere. Most business leaders are familiar with the phrase VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous business environment within which we operate. What many aren't aware is that came from the American War College. As a result of the end of the Cold War, that was what defined the future of the contemporary operating environment. So volatility, uncertainty are things that the military operate within all the time. And so what I would suggest is that the various approaches that we would use in the military absolutely translate across. One of which, and it's one of the key ones, is communicating the intent of the mission. What is it we are here to achieve, and why do we need to achieve that? And communicating that very compelling narrative to everybody under command. And we call it under command, but that's leadership. It's orders are just giving direction. So people have this misconception that the army is all about command and control and orders and tell, and it's not. It's very much like compelling people to do things, much more collaborative. But if you can communicate what it is you want to achieve and what the benefits of achieving that are, then when the situation changes and someone has the information to make a decision, they can freely make that decision, knowing that the outcome of that gets you a step closer to that end state, regardless of the fact that the situation has changed around you. If everyone knows what part they play in the plan, and they understand what the end state or what the next milestone is, they can make a decision within that framework and within those boundaries to make sure that that gets you a step closer. In the military, that's called mission command. Outside, it's called intent-based leadership. Which you'll have heard of, I'm sure.
So it's almost like having everyone be very clear on what the North Star is, to use another phrase. And if you get off course, you know how to recalibrate towards that known target. Yeah.
There's a famous US Navy SEAL called Jocko Willink, who does a successful podcast, nowhere near as successful as this one, obviously. He's got a couple of 100 episodes out there, written a couple of books, but one of the things he talks about is intent as well. It's a big military thing. And you're going to a mission, you've got to get eyes on a particular target location, for example, is one of the examples he uses, and you've got to get on top of this building in order to see the target. And when you get there, that building's been bombed out, that building doesn't exist anymore. So you don't go, oh, never mind. You find a different way of getting eyes on that target. And the commander on the ground doesn't get on the radio back and say, oh, he's not here, can you please tell us what to do? They move to the location whereby they can get eyes on, which might be further forward, might be a bit more risky, might be further back to another elevated location. But it's about that flexibility, the logical thinking, and the ability to come up with a plan.
That's really that is exactly the kind of advice I was hoping you'd be able to
You're
share.
welcome.
The next one I wanted to talk about is coming to terms with feelings of failure, and maybe like the guilt that surrounds that. If there's people struggling to deal with traumatic life events, or losing a job, or even that feeling that everyone gets when a project might not have gone as well as possible. I mean, again, when you're dealing with the stakes that you guys are used to dealing with, there must be tools to help overcome scenarios. So I wonder, again, what kind of advice you might have for leaders that are trying to move through those type of challenges.
Reflection and communication. Again, there's going to be a theme that emerges here, I'm sure. I haven't seen the questions, but I'm pretty sure there'll be a theme that emerges in the responses. Things go wrong. Life is not a bed of roses. It's not a soft play area. There are sharp corners. You're going to get bumps and bruises on the way through. So communicate to those around you who you trust. Tell them how you're feeling. Allow that time to reflect and say it out loud. That's the beauty of coaching, is saying things out loud, hearing your own voice. You can kind of self-coach internally, but there's a real value to hearing your own voice say it and get it physically out of you. Reach out to people who understand and have either failed, if you want to call it that, or have been through those challenging experiences themselves. But also reflect on what went wrong. There's a large thought process out there that resilience is dusting yourself down, right, let's go again. No, this is there's no space, so you're reacting rather than responding to the failure. That sort of Viktor Frankl's approach to stimulus and reaction. Actually, you want to put an air gap in and be a bit more conscious, deliberate and intentional, and respond, which is a much more deliberate process than reaction. So something's gone wrong. Why did it go wrong? Own your part in it. If you did make a mistake, hands up. We're in Bournemouth at the moment. The Air Festival is about to start. We're lucky not to have the Red Arrows doing handbrake turns on the roof as we record this. But after the Red Arrows do every single sortie, they will come down and say, actually, I did this a little bit wrong. I did that a little bit wrong. All elite teams and high-performing teams own their mistakes and do quality after-action reviews. And if there's no stigma attached to making mistakes, and people own it, acknowledge it, and are responsible for it and accountable, then that's a great springboard to start from.
Yeah, no, that reflection fund, you should mention that. That's become a theme that a couple of guests have actually talked about. And like you say, we had the team workologist on who completely echoed that sentiment and said exactly what you did, that high performing teams always build in that period of reflection, because there's always room for improvement, or there's room to analyse what might not have gone as well and put it right next time.
This is where a lot of organisations fall down, is the operational tempo is so significant and so rapid. They don't build in that time for reflection. So project A starts, it might overrun a little bit, which means by the time you deliver project A, project B has already started.
You're already behind.
Yeah, exactly. So, to build in that time is so important, but it's a truism, time is money. So you spend time reflecting. People don't do after-action reviews. They don't what we used to call post-operational tour reports or post-exercise reports. They don't build time in to do that effectively with no stigma attached to where the ownership of the error went.
Yeah. And I guess another related area to this is, how can you support people that you've seen go through those challenges? I know from reading and watching some of your previous interviews and so on, you've obviously had really challenging times through your career. And I heard you say that you'd had really fantastic support from your seniors at times. And I just wondered whether you could kind of elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, they just give you the time and they ask those deep searching questions. What happened? How do you feel about it? What would you like to have happen in the future? Knowing what you know now, what would you do in the future? There's no point in revisiting that particular scenario. It's history. It's an uncontrollable, excuse me. It's an uncontrollable. You can only focus on the controllables now.
Yeah.
So it's a case of, okay, let's look at what went wrong, but understand a problem space without lingering and spending too much time in it. And they would stop me spending time in that space and dwelling on what went wrong. In the TED Talk and in the book, I talk about losing a soldier early on in my career, which was a very, very profound incident for me, but changed the way I approach leadership from that day forwards. Now, I spoke to my officer commanding at that point. He was 2 or 3 ranks above me. I also spoke to the padre, the vicar. I'm not religious at all. I have no judgment about people who are, but that person was used to listening. They were like a professional listener, which also opened up the world of coaching and mentoring to me, of how valuable that space is, which is one of the reasons why I do it now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, some really good advice, I think, to take on from that. You mentioned already that you went through a really, detailed trainee program, I guess, that ended up with you attending Sandhurst. It was clearly a proper structured leadership program in many respects. We talked a little bit off air previously about what that looks like in the corporate world, and I couldn't help but see this statistic from last year that the CMI, the Chartered Management Institute, and YouGov, they did a study into the state of UK leadership, and they found that 82% of leaders in UK PLCs have actually had no training whatsoever before they get into a leadership program. So completely different scenario to what you described with the military. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, because it very much feels like in the corporate world you're almost being set up to fail with that approach.
For sure. So the military train up front in preparation, because the potential outcomes are significant, as you've already alluded to. But there's another statistic in business that whereby most people will take on their first leadership appointment, i.e. direct reports, at around about 26 years old, and they get their first leadership development training around about 42 years old. So you've been making the best part of 20 years worth of errors by that point, or you've found your own way.
You're just doing your best.
So if we start to slice up what you've just said around the shocking percentages that have no leadership development, formal leadership development, they're left to look and try and second guess what's the best approach, which is what makes them feel the best. So they're mirroring and role modelling what other people have done, or they're role playing what they think a leader is, which is normally the all-powerful, decision-making, knowledgeable beast in the room who won't be vulnerable because that's a weakness and they've just got to make the decision rather than saying, oh, I don't know. Yeah. But also, most people in business now are being led by people who are probably around about my age. Most senior leaders are probably in their early 40s to mid-50s, possibly even slightly older. Most of those, if they've had no leadership training, have taken their leadership from post-war leaders. Yeah. And that environment and that context and that operating environment was heavily industrialized, heavily manufacturing, didn't need to worry about the people in place. Whereas now, because you were grateful that you went to a job and you stayed in that job forever. Yeah. Whereas now people are much more transient. They'll spend a couple of years in a place, move on. People are moving on because they are not taken seriously enough. Yeah. You're not in charge of someone who's got 19 seconds to put a widget in a hole for 7 hours a day. And that's your leadership responsibility. You're in charge of people who have thoughts, views, opinions, feelings, emotions. And that brings a new requirement to leadership, which most organisations are still playing catch up to try and find out how to lead the new generations.
Yeah, because like you say, young people now are talking about wanting to work for companies where they share the vision of that company and they've got a purpose. Yeah. It's not about being grateful for having a job, like you said in maybe previous generation.
Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive, and he talks about the 3 key intrinsic motivators of people. Extrinsic motivators don't work. Intrinsic, the ability to master one's craft, the ability to work autonomously within certain remits, and the ability to do meaningful work, i.e. purpose. Mastery, autonomy and purpose. Yeah. So it absolutely mirrors exactly what you've just said.
Yeah, it's a great blueprint, that. So let's talk a little bit now then, your transition into what you're doing now and working with organisations. You left the military after serving for, I think you said 20 years. That's in 2017. Yeah. How did you know that it was the right time to move?
This still gives me goosebumps telling this. It might not give listeners or you goosebumps, but it's my lived experience. So I was Army Barmy. I've already ticked that box off on the podcast. You know, I was going to join the Army and I was going to be in it forever, man. Yeah. It was, 55 or bust. Yeah. I'm still not 55 and I'm not in the Army anymore. So clearly something happened. I deployed to Ukraine. I commanded the first British operation in Ukraine in 2016. I was developing people, had a real passion for developing people and curious about people. And when I came back into the UK, into the Army headquarters where there was a desk waiting for me. And I thought when I joined, when the desk came, because it comes to all of us, doesn't it, is that I would be okay with it when the desk came. So I thought I'd either be sufficiently mature enough to accept that desk or sufficiently immature enough not to. You can decide which one that is. But I came back and I thought, I don't want the desk. I loved being in contact with people and making a difference. And I got a real joy out of doing that in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world around about that sort of time as well. Yeah. So I was developing people in the military, and the military think in very similar ways. So I was coaching and developing, but I was sort of doing it within within a certain boundary set of thought processes. So I thought, right, I'm gonna go and do a coaching course outside with real people with real problems and see if I can do it. So I went on the coaching course. Turns out I really enjoyed it and I was kind of okay at it. And I did this exercise called logical levels or neurological levels, which takes you through a certain thought process. And it was massively profound because during that exercise, and I was used as the guinea pig in front of the rest of the course, I gave myself emotional permission to leave the Army. Wow. And that was deep.
I can imagine.
I sat down at the end and no one said, how was that for you? Because I was still in this after action review, this sort of reflective, deeply reflective. Yeah. And they talked about what they'd witnessed and we all then went off and practiced that exercise. But that was, I think, round about August 2016. So I'd come back from Ukraine. I was thinking about what I wanted to do in the future. Thought I might go into coaching and leadership development outside, because it felt that Ukraine was live. It felt there was a currency, and if I was going to leave, it probably needed to be around about now or 55. And that gave me emotional permission. So I came back in August, resigned my commission in the September, handed my uniform in on the 13th of February 2021, and was paid by Her Majesty until the 21st of April 2021, when, 2017, and left. And that was a hugely emotional thing, because I'd wanted to be in forever, even though it was my choice. When you hand all your uniform in at the end of 20 years service, and they say, yeah, no problem, sir, put it in the burn bag. Your life is going in the burn bag. But no regrets. I left at exactly the right time for me. I've got no regrets. I would still encourage people to join the military of any branch for any period of time that suits you. You don't have to do a full career. It was a great opportunity, learnt loads. And as I say, I left on a high, left at the right time. Any longer, and I think I probably would have regretted not leaving sooner. Whereas now I'm a huge advocate for the forces, and took a load of transferable skills with me.
Oh, it's really good to hear such a positive take on that story, and like you said, to actually have moved at exactly the right time. It's brilliant. So how did you then make the transition into the kind of leadership advisory and consultancy world?
Both feet. I just jumped. There was no safety net there. I was out of the frying pan. I didn't even know if there was a fire there. I just jumped. I was going through a divorce at the time. People were saying, this is a bad time to leave. There's a lot of uncertainty going on in your life. This is not a good thing to do. Ignored all that advice massively. Left. Found it very, very challenging. Started what was called Selfless Leadership Group. That's become Forensic Outcomes over the years. But I got a lot of associate work. When you're about to leave the military, if you've been in certain roles and you've met certain people, then they say, give me a call when you leave. And I've never been shy about asking for help. No. So I called those numbers, and a load of work came my way, and I thought, this is easy. This working for yourself malarkey. No, Mark, just make some calls and people start throwing money at you. And I went off and did some stuff, and that worked really well, in big corporate, large, multi-billion-pound projects. Had little old Paul along to help them out. That was going well, paying well. And then that sort of dried up, and I hadn't done any business development because I didn't really know what business development was. In the military, you don't self-publicise. That's really unpalatable. I won't use the phrase here, but it's unpalatable. You're judged quite rapidly. So I didn't know... Frankly, I didn't know my backside from my elbow. One bent, the other one had a crack in it. Wasn't sure which one was which in terms of business. So I had to go back and just start reaching out again. That same classic, how do I do this? And it was at that point, probably about 18 months, 2 years after leaving, that I started getting mentors, asking people for help and learning loads. Because in the military, you spend years being the army's expert in this job, then 2 years later, the army. So you leave going, I could do that, I'll do this, I'll do that, no problem. But that doesn't serve you when you leave. That whole approach of, I could do that. Marketing, I'll do that. Business development, don't know what it is, can't be that hard. So just massive lesson in humility. Of just sitting down, taking a breath and going, right, this is uncomfortable now. I need to ask for help.
No, well, there's some great lessons in there for everyone. So coming from that military background then, did anything about the corporate world surprise you when you started going into these big organisations?
Yeah, loads. The amount of people who don't do what they say they're going to do. I'll get back to you by such and such a date. Ghosted. I'll do this for you. So there's a lot of lying going on. There's a lot of people saying they're going to do something and never deliver it. There's a lot of people who will not share information. There's that classic tired phrase, which I fundamentally disagree with, knowledge is power. That was happening all over the place. And at board level, Paul on the board, I can't tell everyone what I know because someone else might do it better than me. Because, the military is competitive by nature. of why the military exists, it is competitive, right?
Yeah.
I'd never experienced what I would describe rather as toxic competitiveness. There's a protectionism.
Yeah.
And it seems to be the more senior you get in a lot of organisations, the more people build walls around them. Possibly because of imposter syndrome, possibly because of self-doubt, which I guess is a product of imposter syndrome, or just fear of how long am I got this. This is a competitive world, and I can't own my mistakes because I'll get sacked for it.
Yeah.
So the behaviours that I saw were totally incongruent with most of the behaviours in the military.
Yeah.
And I had to get used to that. You're not going to change them, so you might as well get used to them and then point out what the effect of those behaviours are. And that's one of the things that I do.
Yeah, I was going to say that must have been a massive eye-opener, a real shock from the way you're describing it. And all of that stuff you've described, I've definitely seen that in different guises, and not even just always at a senior level. I think that kind of idea of people holding on to their knowledge out of fear can happen at any level. You know,
Agreed.
People are worried about losing their jobs and think if they teach someone else how to do something, then suddenly it puts them out of the usefulness. So no, definitely.
And that may well be based on their own lived experience as well. Who am I to come out of an organisation that didn't operate like that to say, oh no, that's wrong?
Yeah.
Because actually it could be that way.
Yeah, no, that's
well, that was one of the drivers for changing the business name, actually, because selflessness didn't land.
No.
Selfless leadership group. Some people, I love that name, but they weren't my ideal clients. My ideal clients were going, why selfless leadership group? What's that all about? So now forensic outcomes, people, tell me about that.
Yeah.
You know, there's an intrigue behind that name that draws people in.
Well, you've set it up perfectly. So shall we let's dive into forensic leadership. This is your theory on leadership, and I think for the benefit of everyone listening, I've seen the TED Talk, but I always, as I mentioned to you earlier, I have this vision of you having this eureka moment. And I know you said that actually goes way back, but I wonder if you could just tell everyone the story about Dr. Edmond Locard and how you came across him and how that ended up almost being an inspiration for your philosophy.
Sure. Well, let me sort of do that backwards, if you like. A guy called Neil Powell, who was an army officer, introduced me. He was an ex-Royal Military Police Special Investigations Branch captain, and he introduced me to the Locard exchange principle. And at that point, it became clear through discussion that this had an absolute place in leadership domain. So it wasn't this sort of huge moment. It was a couple of mates having a chat. He introduced me to this concept that had come from his past, and there was this, as all great ideas, you bounce it off each other, and then it was, wow, we're actually onto something here. So there was never this sort of light bulb bing moment. It was a good chat, and it fit.
Yeah.
So let's go back to who Edmond Locard is. He's a scientist. He's a physician, a doctor as well. Born in 1877, died in 1966. I don't think that's linked to the World Cup win at all. He's French. But he's the father of forensic science. He identifies that you can identify bodies, and he did a lot of this in the First World War, identifying French war dead to be able to repatriate them to their families, which is a really wonderful thing. But the Locard exchange principle says that this chair is leaving a trace on me. The fibres from the chair will be found on me by a forensic scientist if they look hard enough. And I am leaving a trace on the chair. The criminal enters the crime scene and leaves a trace on the crime scene. That might be the criminal's own DNA, fibres from their clothing, footprints, things like that. And the crime scene leaves a trace on the criminal. It could be a scratch from the glass. It could be the victim's DNA, carpet fibres, paint flecks. We've seen it because we've seen the news, we've seen Vera, we've seen CSI. We know that forensic science, we know how it works. We might not know it as the Locard exchange principle, but we know that this is how lots of people are put in prison, because forensic science cannot perjure itself. It's only humans who can do that.
Every contact leaves a trace.
Correct. So that's how The Locard exchange principle has been condensed down and is now remembered: every contact leaves a trace. If you lift that, and indeed the whole theory that sits around it as well, but just that phrase, and drop it into the leadership domain, it remains absolutely constant. Every contact leaves a trace. You and I are having an interaction now that we will leave. I will have a perception of how that interaction went. It'll be a positive one.
I was going to say, plenty of green traces.
You will have a perception of how that goes. And simplistically, a positive one is a green interaction, a negative one is a red one, although they sit on a sliding scale. And we can measure those. So somewhat simplistically, it's not binary because it is a sliding scale. Leaders leave traces.
And I heard you describe it like you said, it's almost like different colours on a sliding scale, isn't it? It's not there is red and there's green, there's different shades of both of those, which is key. So you've talked about that's the underlying principle at a high level, the concept that leaders will either leave red or green traces on people
to some degree or another,
and then that ripple effect continues. As I said right from the start, as soon as I came across it, it really resonated with me. I just really loved the idea. I think it's such a compelling idea. And it, in a funny way, it feels very easy to kind of understand and grasp. But I think, I don't know if it's because there's almost like a visual aspect to it, but this concept of the green and the red, I think it really makes it kind of easy for people to understand and then probably go on to apply.
Thank you.
So forensic leadership, you've based it on 3 guiding principles.
That's right.
I'd really like to take some time to explore those 3. So number 1, care.
Yeah. Great leadership comes from a position of care. I would contend, and you know, it's not just from my own experience in the military. To write a book about leadership with only my experience would be a supremely arrogant thing to do, because I've made loads of mistakes, and I'm not saying I'm the best leader in the world, but during those 20 years and 7 years subsequently, and of course life before that, I've been privileged to work with literally thousands of leaders, from tribal chiefs in jungles to members of royal families, you know, ambassadors, you know, every level in there. So I've seen great leaders, I've seen some less than great leaders, and the best ones genuinely care about those around them, because if you do genuinely care, you can't help but leave green traces. If you don't care, I would suggest you're not leading. You might be managing, and you might be managing that team very well and those people, but you're not leading, because for me, leading brings an emotional connection, an emotional bond, which is care.
And I love the fact that in other work I've seen of yours, you're on record as saying it's a bit of myth busting, because this is very much a military approach and not something that people necessarily imagine when they think of Full Metal Jacket and drill sergeant shouting
and Windsor
people.
Davies, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is showing my age. A lot of people listening to this going, who the hell's Windsor Davies? But yeah, that traditional sergeant major bark orders, I say you do, I tell you to jump, you ask how high and when you can come back down, all that sort of stuff. Yes, military training is harsh because the environment that we operate in is harsh, and it has to be, but it doesn't need to be brutal. And actually, by the time you're through that early phase of training, you very quickly getting into an environment that is much more collaborative, much more much more just steady state, because it's a very, very professional organisation, and you don't get the best of people in a command and control environment. I know, as a result of my background, and people in the emergency services, people in all walks of life, parents will know that command and control does not work unless you're in a very, very specific crisis situation, and even then only for a very short period of time. So this, you know, I couldn't work in an organisation that tells you what to do all the time. Well, nor could I, and I didn't.
It's interesting, this whole, I mean, it was a real interesting moment for me to kind of discover it and think of it in those terms. And I guess when I was reflecting, I imagine, you know, in the army, you're spending a lot of time together with your fellow soldiers, in these extreme circumstances we kind of talked about before. So you naturally develop that feeling, that compassion, and that care. And we're all familiar with those phrases like bands of brothers. You wouldn't think of them just as colleagues. But how do you cultivate that approach in a more corporate environment?
Spending time, funny old thing, communicating. We've spoken a couple of times already about the operational tempo of organisations is such that the leader doesn't get enough time to spend with the led, with their direct reports. It's about spending time. It's about making things stretch targets, making them challenging but not impossible. We want to stretch people but not break them. Because through those challenging times comes a bond. If things are easy, then you can just sit back and relax, and there's no need to talk and collaborate quite as closely. So when there is challenging times, when we are in a change environment, that's when teams tend to come together, setting them stretch targets rather than things that are just easy to achieve. We're sat in a room where you've got some marathon medals on the wall. You got a marathon medal for finishing something that is hard, is a stretch target. You didn't get a medal for walking up the stairs to come into the podcast studio. So we admire and we acknowledge stretch, and people actually operate at their best when they're being stretched, not broken, just stretched. And that means different things to different people.
I mean, all of that makes complete sense, because I guess the other aspect of this that I was interested to talk about was I think again, Nick, the teamworkologist, talked about 85% of our success being down to being people. People, persons, and that one of those attributes would be they care about those around them. You talked earlier about how leaders can be made, but I did want to ask whether you teach someone to care, because we've all met people that feels very false, when someone talks to you and you're like, you don't really care, this isn't genuine. But
human beings are really good at picking up on incongruence, aren't we?
Exactly.
It's the picture doesn't match the sound.
They
come across as if they care, but it's not real. You don't
They've
feel
read
it.
the manual.
Exactly. So it's got to be genuine care. Can you teach it? I don't think you can teach care, but what you can do is hold the mirror up in the hope that they've got enough emotional intelligence to self-correct and say, when you behave in this way, you tend to leave red traces, whereas when you behave in that way, you tend to leave green. When you say this in a meeting, everyone else, have you noticed everyone else raises their eyebrows or their heads go down, they pretend to take notes? You can only really hold that up, because I don't believe you can teach care, but you can certainly highlight the behaviours that happen when you don't care, and the reactions to that, and the reactions and behaviours that are bred when you do care, and hope that the person joins the dots. If they don't, then there's a conversation to happen that is perhaps more on the mentoring tell side. But even then, you can tell someone to care. They won't. Lots of the leadership development work I do, people will go, hang on, we haven't got the return on investment. Well, that's because they're not doing what they've been recommended to do, the one or two. Most times, we love the work you've done, and they see huge, gains in the organisation. But one or two are either at their plateau, and therefore they can't take on the extra care, or they don't care. And that's a great way of filtering out non-leaders in the organisation if they don't adapt to change.
I was going to say, that's almost like there's a different conversation to be had then, isn't there, about whether you've got the right people in those leadership positions.
Which kind of brings us on to the second guiding principle of noticing.
Perfect. Well, I'll let you notice.
Sorry, I'll take it over here. But you've got to notice that, haven't you? So as a leader, you've got to notice what's going on in you and for you. You've got to notice what's going on around you. You've got to notice when people are doing well and give feedback to that effect. So when I started writing the book, notice was called recognition. But it's more than recognition. Recognition is a subset of noticing. So if this is generally how I rock up, if I'm feeling particularly posh, I might put a jacket on. Or if I'm feeling properly posh, I'll put a tie on nowadays. But I will normally be clean shaven, my shirt is pressed, it's never the same shirt 2 days on the bounce, it's never the same trousers. So if I rock up to work and I've got the same shirt on for a couple of days, I look unshaven, or I've got a bit of breakfast down my front, that's the time to notice and say, Paul, I've noticed the following. Are you okay? So we jump back from notice into care.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful phrase that comes from the military, again, funny old thing. It comes from ground sign awareness, which is, does the ground look different? If it does, something has happened there. So in Afghanistan, if the ground looked different, there's a chance there might be an improvised explosive device in that part of the ground. So you avoid it. And it's called the absence of the normal and the presence of the abnormal.
Yeah.
Well, again, lift that up and drop it into the human domain. If you've got a female colleague who's always, well turned out, always happens to put a full face of makeup on, not that there's a requirement to do that, but if that's their thing and they start turning up to work and they haven't got makeup on, then you've got to gently, in a green way, not go, oh, you haven't got any makeup on, what's wrong with you? That's clumsy and is going to leave a red trace and create a barrier.
Yeah.
It's, I've noticed the following things. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Or not say what you've noticed. Just step in. So notice the bad things, but also notice the good things. And that's where the recognition comes from. It's coming, who's brought the plants in? It looks much better in here with some greenery in the office. Yeah, I did that. Well done, Stuart. That's amazing. Thanks very much for leaning into that.
Catch people doing things right.
There you go.
Yeah.
Ken Blanchard.
Yeah.
Too many leaders and managers catch people doing things wrong.
Yeah.
Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Well, that's immediate red trace left. Catch people doing something right, green trace, people witness that green trace, that then becomes a green ripple. People want that.
Yeah.
And they step closer.
Well, I was certainly happy when I noticed that you were wearing your uniform and you were definitely turned up ready to do this today. So we got there, number one, care, number two, notice, moving on to the third principle, transparency.
Yeah. Now this, ironically, I've just raised my eyebrows as you said it, can raise eyebrows sometimes. We're not talking about radical transparency. We're not talking about sharing why Paul was sacked, how much money Paul was on, or the things that cash flow within the business. We're not talking about that level of transparency.
That is interesting though, because before you move on, I did want to ask you about that, because in your book you talk about the three potential approaches to transparency, and number one is that radical transparency where everybody from all levels knows all information, all financial results, what the CEO had for breakfast, kind of thing. And I was interested that you said that Netflix actually follow that approach.
They did, yeah. So did KLM.
Okay.
The Dutch airlines. You'll notice that's past tense.
Yeah.
Did. Because at the time it feels good, it feels all very inclusive, it feels all very, let's all be in the same knowledge base together.
Yeah.
But it starts to erode things very quickly when you see that someone who is apparently doing the same job as you or not as good as you is on much, much more money. Yeah. That it creates problems.
And it's not just financial, I don't think, is it? Sometimes it's best for people not to know certain things because you're going to worry everyone, for example, if you're sharing everything. Yeah. So I guess that brings us on to the other two approaches. So the first one we kind of talked about a bit earlier, which is like zero transparency. That's that whole knowledge is power and we're not going to share anything. Clearly not the way to go. So we're looking for the third approach, which is finding that sweet spot of appropriate transparency. Yeah. But how do you find that level in an organisation?
I use it in the book, the term appropriate, which is deeply unhelpful because it can mean anything to anybody, can't it? So, there's my slopey shoulders approach to transparency. But I think that there's transparency around, business elements of, like during COVID. The best organisations were transparent about, listen, we've turned the marketing off, we've turned the L&D off, we've turned a lot of things off because cash flow has gone through the floor. So we now would prefer you to work only 3 days a week and we're going to have to furlough 40% of the organisation in order that we can come out at the end of this, whenever that is and whatever it is. Yeah. So that level of transparency is at the top end of vulnerability. And the best organisations did that. And what they found, as always with vulnerability, was people stepped closer. They went, okay, yeah, I get it. I really want a job in 2 years' time or 6 months' time, depending on where we were in the COVID sort of cycle.
Yeah.
And people stepped into that. But there's also a transparency around your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. So, and an example I use all the time, because we all have it, is that occasionally you have a night where you see every hour of the clock. You're a new father, congratulations. And there will be times when baby might keep you awake at night. That's no fault of your own, but you are more likely to leave red traces and react negatively to things the following day because you're knackered.
Yeah.
That's just human nature.
How am I doing so far?
You're doing really well. Really well. Really well. I'm speaking a lot to try and keep you awake or put you to sleep. I'm not sure. But if you own that at the start, you go in and say, do you know what? I've had a really bad night. Next door's dog kept me awake. The baby kept me awake. I was too hot. I've just had one of those nights.
Yeah.
You own the red traces before you risk leaving them.
Yeah.
Then there's a level of vulnerability. Again, it's there's no mistake. I've repeated that. That people go, oh, okay, I get it. And then can you gently let me know that I'm being clumsy?
Yeah.
And it's important that you ask them to do it gently. Otherwise, you're going to react negatively, aren't you? If your fuse is slightly shorter that day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The other aspect, because I think that's talking a lot about communication, which is obviously key to this whole area of transparency. Sure. The other area I really found interesting that I reflected on was from your TED talk, where you were saying that organizations, they just don't talk about leadership.
No.
And you posed the question, like, when did you last talk about leadership? And I found that really interesting because, again, with anything, you need feedback. I think human beings, we need feedback in order to learn and grow and develop. So what's your thoughts on that area, what you've seen in organizations, and what does good look like in terms of talking about leadership openly?
Well, I think if we look at, firstly, that most organizations talk about leadership in hushed tones, and it's negative. Oh, that person's a right chump. Paul did this. Can you believe Paul did that in that last meeting? And that's how leadership is discussed, in negative. We talk about the red traces without realising that they are the red traces, of course.
Yeah.
Whereas where it happens positively is where you talk about and you own the leadership errors and sort of the freedoms and constraints, if you like. So you talk about the leadership freedoms and what's gone well, and you also talk and own what's not gone well. So it comes back to that thing that we spoke about right at the start, about ownership of your leadership, being humble and vulnerable enough to reach out and say, I'm not quite sure how to do this. Transparent about your own lack of ability or knowledge or capacity or capability in that area, and ask for help. I was a platoon commander of a group of soldiers, all of whom had served longer than me. I was in charge. So there were times I had to say, right, how do you think we should do this? Yeah. Oh, sir, I think this, I think that. And you then take it on as your own thing, as your own plan, and you are responsible, accountable for the plan. You give the orders, you think about it, and you make it happen. As the leader, you take it on. But there's a humility to good leaders that requires you to actually just ask a little bit more, which is be more conscious. I mention it in the book again, conscious, deliberate, and intentional in the manner in which you lead. Slow down, and you'll get more done.
And we've got to share that phrase that I said to you. I love.
Go for it.
I don't know if I can do it justice. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast.
Yeah, exactly. It's used in lots of militaries. I think the US Marines use it. The US Navy SEALs use it. The Royal Marines use it. It's just everywhere. And that is, get your skills and drills done smoothly. If you take it out of the military context and put it into golf, if you try and hit the golf ball hard, it's going to go in a whole raft of different directions. So you get the skills sorted out first. You get your, the drive nice and smooth, the motion really smooth, and then the distance will come.
Yeah, it comes from the technique,
exactly.
Not the brute force.
Yeah, so it's tools, techniques, and procedures rather than kicking the door down and going straight in.
Yeah.
So it's about, and the same is true of leadership. Yeah. Just slow things down, think more, and you'll get more done. There's an oxymoronic approach here. If you slow down and become more deliberate, conscious and intentional in the way in which you lead, you will lead better, you'll get more done, and fewer people will knock on your door because you will be creating leaders at different levels in the organisation. They'll stop knocking on the door asking you how to do things.
No, absolutely. As I said, Paul, I love the book. We could spend all day talking about. There's so much more covered in the book, and we talked earlier about some ideas that I really enjoyed, the 10th man rule, and we'll leave that as a bit of a cliffhanger for people to go and explore. But I did want to talk about, before we move on, one last piece, because I think everyone hopefully understands that we want to be green leaders. We want to be spreading these green traces in our day-to-day interactions. I did want to talk a little bit, though, about the red traces. I think we need to at least touch on that, because they do or can tend to lead a more lasting impact, sadly. I guess human nature being what it is. We all remember being told things at school or by previous bosses. But I wanted to talk to you because the flip side is that sometimes that negativity can actually be a really powerful motivator.
Yeah.
And I've heard people talk about people either being driven or dragged, where driven is a more positive, motivator. But being dragged is either running away from something, whether it's shame, insecurity, you might be angry, you're told you're a loser and you're never going to amount to anything. And sadly, like I say, human nature being what it is, it does seem like a lot of successful people are being dragged by those insecurities and that fear of failure, rather than being driven by inspiration. And we talked earlier again about sports people. I hear a lot of sports stars saying that they didn't enjoy their careers during the time because they were actually motivated by a fear of losing rather than the reward of winning.
Yeah.
So with that rather long intro, I just wondered, what's your thoughts on how, red traces sometimes can be that powerful motivating force?
They can be, but that comes down to the individual who has received the red, not the person giving it. Occasionally I'm challenged by, wouldn't it be good to leave a red in this sort of training environment to make a lesson well remembered? No, because what you're asking there is, should I, as a result of an interaction, leave the other person thinking I'm an absolute arse?
Yeah.
No, why would you want to do that? But yeah, sure, sometimes we are left with red traces. I've got them from school. I know people my age who are still trying to prove that teacher wrong today.
Yeah.
Whereas other people, as you say, have gone, no, screw you. I'm going to show you, and I'm going to use that as a motivator to get me to do other things. So that comes down to a level of emotional intelligence, a level of the ability to forgive, I think, and understand that the context then was different to the one you're in now. But it is a case of, again, there's that theme, reflecting on, okay, that happened, it hurt, it's an uncontrollable, how do I avoid that hurt, and am I doing it for the right reasons?
Yeah.
So notice what's going on in you and be transparent with yourself about the reasons why you're doing it based on self-care, which is the guiding principles again, but in a mirror. Yeah. So move on, but for the right reasons. Don't do something just to prove that person wrong, because you're not getting satisfaction from that.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting way actually flipping on its head, because I guess, like you say, just because it might have had some positive impact for an individual because they've been able to process it in that way, doesn't mean it was the right thing to do for that leader or whoever it might be.
I've come across sports coaches and business leaders, I'm not going to mention any names because they may end up listening to this and they're still leading and coaching, but they try and vicariously bask in the reflective glory of that, but that's because I told them they'd never amount to anything. No, it's not. You left a massive red trace on that individual that has anchored itself differently in their cerebral cortex, and you're keeping them awake at night. You're the reason why they're a fully paid up member of the 3 a.m. club. They're not sleeping soundly knowing that they've succeeded because of you, it's despite you.
Yeah.
Or in spite of you.
That says a lot about that leader, that they're actually going around telling people and trying to praise.
Well, we're then going to directly challenge the term leader in that context, aren't we?
Absolutely. So, talking about how you mentioned earlier the business that's come off the back of the philosophy, forensic outcomes.
Yeah.
How do you take all of these learnings and everything and work with organisations?
Well, lots of different ways, really. So there is a web app. So it's a diagnostic that we've developed called Dacto app that's mentioned in the book that measures these forensic leadership capabilities, gives you deep insight into leadership capability of individuals, teams and organisations. So that's one way we work with organisations, is to gather data, quantitative data on leadership capability, and that you get to see that schematically, graphically, and then we can actually create interventions to develop leadership capability in individuals, or identify individuals who are at their peak or have gone beyond it and aren't the future leaders. So it helps with succession planning and all that kind of stuff.
I before you move on from that, I'm a bit of a geek for those type of tools, so I might ask to have a cheeky look at that at some point.
Let's do it. You'd be welcome to.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what that looks like.
Anyone listening who wants to do it, reach out and we'll do a demo.
Yeah, no, sounds great.
The other thing is, I tend to work with organisations. My favourite organisation to work with is one that's scaling up, because there's a very, very human element to scaling up that a lot of people don't actually identify early on. And just because it was a whizzo idea for you and I to start a business and it's gone pretty well, doesn't mean we're the people who should lead it. I spoke to someone recently and she said something along the line, I might mess these stats up, but something in the order of only 40% of founder-led startups are still led by the founder. And of those who leave, 80% are sacked rather than choose to leave, because they're not leaders. They don't have it. They're great entrepreneurs, great startups, but they're not destined to lead an organisation.
It's a completely different skill set,
it is.
Isn't it? And I think the real successful ones are the ones that recognise that, and they actually hire people that are better than them at doing all
For
of
sure.
that other stuff.
Or they develop themselves early.
Yeah.
And I work with organisations to do both of those things. I work with other organisations as well, but that's one of my preferred areas to work with. It is correct any leadership errors before they even start. We spoke about at the start, 80% of organisations and people have never had any leadership development. I think leadership development should start on day one. As soon as you're recruited into an organisation, you're told what the leadership behaviours are, and therefore that makes you a better follower, and therefore it means you're likely to work better in the organisation and help with the succession planning.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you mentioned the type of organisations that you prefer to work with, because I was going to ask if there's any warning signs of an organisation that's not ready to embrace these forensic leadership approach. You must sometimes, I guess, walk into a place and go, oh, not sure this is a challenge here.
Yeah, and it goes back to that phrase I used earlier on, human beings are great at picking up on incongruence. And I pick up on it almost straight away. I wasn't working with, I almost worked with an organisation where the CEO was just, no, I think it's a good thing to leave red traces every now and again. It's very binary. Your model's very binary. It's green or red. And you think, we're not going to work well together here. In which case you signpost to someone who I think you probably would work well with, or warn everybody off not to go near them with a barge pole because, actually that individual was just, I need to get a management trainer in. Well, I'm a leadership development specialist. I'm not a management trainer. Okay, whatever. And you just okay. It's like picture no sound. You're talking against a brick wall. And at that point, knowing who I work well with, and I work best with people who are leading well but know they can do better. Those are people who have made learning a craft. They want to, like Daniel Pink's book, they want to master the craft. They want to be more autonomous and more purposeful. And those are the people I work better with. Those who know, I've got loads to learn.
Yeah.
You know, it took me ages to use the word expert in my own LinkedIn profile because I thought, ooh, that's got certain connotations for me.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a comparative term.
Yeah.
You know, and I do know a fair bit about leadership, not everything.
Yeah.
But that's part of the joy of doing what I do, is I learn through every interaction I have as well.
You've almost set up these next set of questions perfectly, because as I said to you when I met you, like I've always, like since I've become aware of you and read your LinkedIn and the posts you put in and some of the literature and heard you talk, it's clear to me you are a real scholar. You're a student of leadership, which I really like to see. So I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you about something that I'm always curious about, and that is, how important do you think charisma is in a leader?
Big. Yeah, it's important. Now, I think what people quite often trip up on with charisma is extroversion and volume. So you can be very charismatic but very quiet. You can be a charismatic introvert where you get the energy from being you rather than drawing the energy from people and the context around you. Yeah. So charisma is really important because the best leaders tell the best stories. Yeah. And it's that compelling narrative that creates leadership. Back to communication again. And you've got to have a level of charisma to be able to tell a good story. You haven't got to be loud, you haven't got to be brash, you haven't got to be, the centre of the party, the clown of the class, or whatever you were told at school. You don't have to be that person, but you have to be able to compel people to do that which you want them to do in a compelling narrative that's transparent enough that they can understand and identify what part they play in the plan. And therefore they'll step up and play that part. That's where the transparency comes in again from the book.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that, because I've always felt that instinctively, that there's something, you need that X factor in a leader to really excel, in my opinion. So yeah. I'm glad that the expert agrees.
Great, thank you.
The other thing was just a thought, like, do you think teams can ever be effective with poor leaders?
Yes, because if it's it's a rarity, so it's a yes, but sometimes the leader can be ignored. So they're a figurehead, they're not a leader. They might be the head of department, but they're not leading. And what you find is you get leaders who emerge at the right time in the right place throughout the team. We'll do this. The context determines that Stuart is the best leader for this environment, and he chooses to step up and lead or say something that other people decide to follow. Yeah. So one of the best definitions of leadership I've ever come across were these guys called Coos and Posner. They wrote the definition in 1998 of leadership is a reciprocal relationship between those who choose to lead and those who decide to follow. Which I think is a beautiful definition.
That is brilliant, yeah.
But it doesn't mean the person at the top of the pyramid is the leader. You can have people throughout the pyramid emerging at the right time to say, I know, let's do this. And you see it in loads of, especially in crisis, when an individual steps up and says something, and they're not the leader, they might even be a stranger, but at that time they've said the right thing, and people go, what you said, let's do that.
Yeah. And
then someone else might emerge later on at the next phase of whatever that thing is, be it a crisis or be it whatever the situation is.
Yeah, no, interesting to get your thoughts on that. Another theme of this podcast that I want to talk to you about is happiness. That's one of the regular recurring themes. What is it? How do we get it? And I always think it's interesting because happy, it's such a small word in some ways. It's one of the first words any kid learns.
Yeah.
But it's almost become so complex in the modern world now.
Sure.
And I just wondered, what for you is the true meaning of happiness?
I think it's a sense of belonging, a sense of being able to be genuinely me. I mean, authenticity is a word that's overused, but be authentically me. Be in an environment where I can share my hopes, my fears, my frustrations, my dreams without those being used against me. That's when I feel comfortable. That's when I feel happy, and it's being surrounded by love and joy. For me, happiness used to be different things at different phases in life, and I think it's right and proper that you do change what that point is through life, because we go through developmental stages. But the stage I'm at the moment, happiness is time with family, time in a place where I'm loved and I can love.
Yeah, well, perfect answer to the question.
Thanks.
And going back to that, because we talked at the start about what success, again, another theme, meant to you at the start of your career, when it was more about that idea of progression and maybe a validation externally. Following all the journey that you've been on, and sat here today, how's that evolved, and what does success mean to you now?
That's a great question. And again, it is an evolutionary journey. First time I've said journey on the podcast, and I'm going to kick myself as I leave because I've said it. But for me, it's freedom. And there are different freedoms. So there's freedom of time is the one that I'm going to hold on to today. Freedom of time to be able to do broadly what I want when I want. Is why I work for myself. We've got, between my fiance and I, we've got a couple of businesses, and that gives us freedom of time. Now, of course, that implies a certain level of financial wealth, because you've got to be able to pay the bills and do all that. So it is a privileged position to be in. I don't disregard that, and I know that I'm very fortunate to have that. But for me, currently, I measure success in where I've come from in 50 years, to have that freedom to make decisions for myself and for my family, and have the resource to be able to follow through on those decisions. That is success for me.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Again, another great answer. And I always find it interesting as well to ask, what do you think are the most important skills that you've learned and developed over time that's enabled you to do what you do successfully?
Calm, patient. I used to be very, very judgmental. Now I'm not. I do the Stephen Covey thing of seek to understand. I've always asked when I don't understand something, but that was mixed with a level of judgment as well. It's kind of this weird, horrible cocktail. But now I tend to seek more. I am curious, and people intrigue me. I'm curious or nosy, you decide. I love knowing people's stories. I love finding out what makes them tick. And so there's certainly that curiosity around me for that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that the first word you came to was calm, because I think that's one of the characteristics you identified in that first leader I asked you about. So clearly that's really resonated with you through that.
Well, I've been in situations where I've not been calm, but as a result of that lived experience, my scale of 1 to 10 is slightly different to most people's. So, I think I use this sliding scale analogy quite a lot. So if someone's normally at a 3, something that would elevate them by 3 will take them to a 6. Whereas, for example, the COVID pandemic put everyone pretty much at a 6 residual. So anything that would normally only take you up by 3 is now taking you to a 9. Whereas, because I'm not as emotionally involved in my clients' businesses as they are at an 8, 9, possibly even a 10 because of what's going on. And that's right and proper that they are at that, but they need this calming influence, this, okay, what do we know? What data have we got? What can we do about it? And something I do is help organisations anticipate when and why they're going to get to an elevated score on that sliding scale and avoid that.
Yeah. I'm just interested, you mentioned you haven't always been this way, so developing that calm and also losing some of that judgment for others, how has that occurred? Has that been a conscious decision, or is that just the passing of time and experience?
A bit of both. So I've made some whacking mistakes, but I've had the, whatever you call it, the gumption, the wherewithal, the humility, the emotional intelligence, or the bruises, to sit there and go, I don't want to feel this way again. I don't want that to happen again. So have that period of reflection, take myself away, be that for a few minutes or a few hours. Certainly there was a couple of incidents in the military where before we went into an after action review, it would be, right, let's get away, spend some time cleaning weapons, sorting your kit out, and then we'll come back in an hour's time and do the review. That was intentionally put in by me in order that you could then actually spend that time in self-reflection and think. Or some small groups might get together and clean their kit together and talk about it and get their feelings and emotions up, or have a bit of dark humour, a bit of banter around it if that's where they needed to go with that at the time. Other times it has been as just a process of growing up, becoming a father. That changes you. You know that now, and you're about to go on that joyful experience yourself. And again, congratulations. But it does. You choose your battles. When you're younger, everything is a battle because you've got the energy and you're indestructible and nothing's going to get you. Whereas, once you've got some historic bruises, you think, I just can't. I'm not. It's not worth it. It's not worth the emotional expenditure and the sleepless nights. So I'm just going to let that go.
No, appreciate that. And that leads us on to a feature that I always finished with on the podcast, which is called Life by Misadventure. And you already talked right at the top of this about how your leadership journey started before the army in sports teams. And I always find it interesting about the lessons we do learn outside of our day jobs or and daily working experiences, sometimes completely by accident. And these can be from travelling or anywhere activities we're involved in. So I wonder, what lesson have you learned from an unexpected source?
Well, I mean, thankfully you messaged last night and gave me a bit of warning that this was coming, and I reflected, had a sleepless night, so I might leave red trace. No, I thought about it, and actually I'm not going to go historic, long time. I'm going to go to a lesson that I've been retaught again very recently. I mentioned off air, Emily is my fiancée. Her daughter, my stepdaughter to be, my stepdaughter, age 3, was diagnosed with leukemia. And that, when you hear that word, that changes everything. The context of everything around you changes in an instant. And very quickly, because of the uncertainty. So firstly, you never know what's going to happen. So live in the moment. But that life's misadventure, when it dealt us that hand early on, just highlighted the fact that, and it was Emily who really came up with it first, was if this 3-year-old is going to have leukemia, for the treatment protocol is 115 weeks for a girl of that age with that type of leukemia. It's a long time, right? She's going to be a 3-year-old who just happens to have leukemia, but she's going to be surrounded by joy. And that lesson of, let's just live in the moment. As a business owner, as a young person previously, you're always looking over the horizon. What's next? Well, you can lose sight of the here and now because you may not make it over the horizon. You may not know what's there because it's an uncontrollable anyway. So I'm a big one for let's control the controllables and roll with the uncontrollables. That was a big uncontrollable. And it's not really misadventure, so I might not be fully doing the question justice. But I've been retaught to live in the moment. And yes, I'm ambitious and I want what I know is in the future. But I also live much, much more now in the moment and enjoy the moment and allow it to sort of sweep over me.
Well, really, I love that answer, Paul. And those kind of stories, I mean, they do put everything in perspective, don't they?
They
so
tend to,
it's the perfect way to round off our chat today. Other than to say thank you so much again. It's been so entertaining and informative. Just really enjoyed the conversation. What are the best links for people that have heard this? I'm sure there'll be loads of people wanting to work with you, maybe engage you for a speaking opportunity. So Where can people find you?
LinkedIn, Paul Kinkaid, 2 Ks, or on paulkinkaid.com is the speaking website. So that's got a form. You can reach out directly to me on that.
Excellent. Well, we'll put all of those
Thank
links
you.
in to make it easy for people to find you. I love the idea of forensic leadership, as I've mentioned a few times. The whole idea of leaving green traces. It to me, it just feels like such a refreshing and positive approach to leadership. So I really thank you for putting that together. And that's something we've not even touched upon, but it really feels applicable to personal relationships as well.
Sure.
That's probably another podcast appearance.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's what I was going to say as a sort of closing comment, really, is I've chosen to put that in the leadership domain.
Yeah.
But of course, we've just been talking about relationships the whole way through this.
Yeah.
We've just chosen to put it in the leadership area.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better myself. So all that's left for me to say is thank you again for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Cheers.